If there's one lesson you take away from MiSide, it's this. Mobile games are bad for you. That's it. That's the message. Okay, so there's more to MiSide than spicy takes on free-to-play games. But I will admit, the opening parody of those iOS dating sim games that seem to be everywhere nowadays is on point. The chibi graphics, the energy meters, the rote, simplistic gameplay that serves to funnel players straight to a point of purchase, that sparkly clean, corporately cozy aesthetic, the addictive retention mechanics that keep players coming back day after day after day. It's all here. But the mobile game that kicks off iHosto's 2024 psychological horror game is a tiny fraction of what MiSide has to offer. For its relatively brief playtime, I beat it in just over 4 hours. There's a stunning amount of gameplay. The core game is a first-person narrative adventure game. You interact with the title character, Mita, solve puzzles, play minigames, cook, and run for your life. You see, there's a darker underbelly to MiSide, and the two Russian developers that make up iHosto have a lot to say about the games industry, modern life, and especially modern relationships. If you spent any time with the game's pre-release trailer, this won't come as a shock to you. MiSide comes from a long tradition of indie horror games that use genre tropes and a nostalgic atmosphere as fodder to explore darker themes. But what makes the game uniquely compelling is how well all of this blends together. There's little in the way of downtime, and the game rarely gives you a moment to catch your breath before showing you a new clever mechanic, a new secret, or a new jump scare. Yeah, this one really got me. It's part visual novel, part satire, and part horror. A kind of Doki Doki Literature Club meets PT by way of Sylvia Plath. And it's incredibly compelling. There's lots to dissect in MiSide's weird, unsettling universe. Lots of lore to discover, Easter eggs to find, and curiosities to puzzle over. But the thing that stood out to me the most was how the game treats the relationship between the player and the various incarnations of Mita you meet along the way. Mita, at least crazy Mita, is definitely the game's chief villain. But the players, all of them, are culpable in their own ways. No one gets out of this game unscathed. Spoilers ahead. MiSide opens with our protagonist downloading a new version of a dating sim, and it starts out innocently enough. The game consists of your typical mobile fare, simple mechanics, microtransactions, a little dialogue sprinkled here and there. So far, so good. Then this happens. And if the chainsaw isn't off-putting enough, you also find a knife in the bathroom. Okay, maybe this is a lesson to more thoroughly vet your e-girlfriends. Apart from the horror movie vibes slowly creeping into the game, there's something else happening here that I think is interesting. Every interaction you have with Mita is transactional. The game within a game is trying to sell you the stereotypical perfect girlfriend fantasy. When she cooks for you, the player is only asked to purchase the ingredients and chop veggies, and she enthusiastically praises you for your ability to successfully carry out these menial tasks. Mita herself is pretty low maintenance, only requiring you to purchase gifts at her request. She also doesn't have much of a personality to speak of. She exists entirely to look cute and entertain you. All she needs is the occasional head pat as an expression of love, and you can send her on her way. While this doesn't seem atypical of your average mobile game, MiSide continually emphasizes how shallow this relationship is. Mita's affectations are performatively adorable, bounding up and down and tilting her head like a puppy. She's the stereotypical moe heroine. Her dialogue is doting and childlike, and the perspective of the playfield forces Mita to constantly look up at the player, giving you the impression that you are this omnipresent, godlike force in her world. And her world is small, consisting only of 4 discrete and very small rooms. You get the impression that not only has she not seen the outside world, but that one doesn't even exist. The game seems to be as much of a power fantasy as it is a fantasy about romance. The important takeaway here is that Mita exists for you to consume. The little work that is expected of you comes in the form of minigames, including this one, where you're inexplicably disassembling these bright pink video game cartridges for reasons that will come back to haunt you later. She's grateful for the help, though, and after spending over a month with her, she starts to want to take things further. She wants to meet you in real life. Wait, what? When you next look up from your phone, you're no longer in your room, but in Mita's, her having transported you inside the game. You can probably guess where the game goes from here. The way the game actually pulls you into Mita's world is really cool. As she begins to draw you closer to the screen, the player's perspective, the one of him hovering over her, begins to change. And the next thing Mita says to you isn't a request. It's an order. Immediately, you feel the power dynamics shift. The player doesn't know where he is, nor has he even consented to suddenly being whisked away into this elaborate fantasy world. Mita's home, which emphasized her simple existence, is now a cage for the player. Exiting out the front door isn't an option. The next time you see Mita, it's from a similar perspective as the one from the mobile game, with her sitting and the player looking down on her. This time, though, that soft, doe-eyed features of her chibi counterpart are gone, and she looks at you with an impish, almost predatory quality. You next return to the cooking minigame, only this time you actually have a chance to eat it and have a pre-dinner chat with your new host. Mita's anime girl speech patterns are still here, but the mere suggestion you might leave, or might want to, gives her dialogue an edge. Emphasized by the shrinking size of the text on screen, it leaves this impression of rage just bubbling under the surface. Once you finish your meal, you quickly realize something else. She's drugged you. It's not hard to see the point the game is making here, and the scene is as effective as it is unsettling. Mita holds your hand as you rapidly lose consciousness, and she feigns concern over your well-being while guiding you to the bathroom. And when you wake up, she's nowhere to be found. When the player finally starts to exert some agency, refusing to act as the toy that Mita so desperately wants you to be, she becomes increasingly hostile and defensive. And then she lets something slip. You aren't the first protagonist Mita has done this to, and every previous player has been discarded by her. Each of the cartridges you've encountered, including the ones you were disassembling earlier, were previous players, and she's treated you all like disposable playthings. As you play the game, you'll find the remains of these cartridges scattered throughout the environment. Picking them up unlocks an optional character bio that you access via the main menu. And if you take the time to read these, you start to notice a pattern. The previous players view Mita as an object, cataloging her positives and negatives. One player even admits to teaching her engineering, a skill she apparently has been using ever since to trap players in her world. The message here is clear. Mita has learned to be this way, and she's learned it all from you. And as she rifles through the players trying to find one that won't leave her, you realize something else. This isn't the only Mita. The first other Mita you find is in the basement. accessible via the closet in Mita's room. She's been locked away by your Mita, and as the two of you formulate an escape plan, you realize this Mita's different. Gone are the bouncy, bubblegum pop speech patterns of crazy Mita. This Mita is straightforward, articulate, and assertive. In fact, rather than being the helpless damsel that you saw in your first encounter with her, kind Mita is the one calling the shots. She's already in the midst of bringing down crazy Mita, and at every point she's one step ahead of the player. Early in the game, the two of you encounter Cool Mita, or Cappy, another version of the character that was originally enlisted to help in bringing down crazy Mita. But unfortunately, her memory has been wiped, and this forces kind Mita to pivot and come up with a new plan. What's interesting here is that she doesn't need the player's help at all. She waves you off and tells you to distract yourself with Cappy while she does what she needs to do. You feel a little like a child at this moment, like you're being asked to keep yourself busy while your parents cook dinner. She even chastises you for bothering her with too many questions. The player here is clearly out of his depth, and the best way he can help is just to stay out of Mita's way. And as the game progresses, you learn something else. Each Mita represents an earlier version, a previous failed attempt to create the perfect virtual girlfriend. And in one scene, you stumble on the actual process for accepting or rejecting each of these versions. You watch as a parade of prototype Mitas are placed in front of you and are given a general series of guidelines as to what a good version of Mita consists of. You check her skeletal structure, her posture, her movements, and ensure that the emotions she experiences are the right ones. Any mismatch results in the prototype getting rejected and being dropped through a trapdoor in the floor. It's pretty clear what's happened here. Crazy Mita is one of these rejected prototypes, one that has managed to insert herself back into the game and is taking revenge on the players. The zombie-like prototype Mitas that stalk you through the game have also gone through this rejection process as well, and they're not happy about the way things have turned out either. The other Mitas that you encounter are fascinating, each one being the game's interpretation of the kind of perfect girl the players would be looking for. Each one not entirely a full person, usually a pastiche of cliches and stereotypical personality quirks. There's Sleepy Mita, whose sole personality is that of being barely conscious, and as the player looks at her voyeuristically as she lays on her bed. There's Mi La, a bookish, not like the other girls, tsundere-style character who, despite her desire to be defiant and unique, is herself another stereotype. There's Ghostly Mita, an unsettling and profoundly depressed Mita who largely ignores the player, lost in her own ennui, desperately looking for herself. Each one of these Mitas, as well as the others you encounter through the game, are examples of Mitas that simply weren't enough, either for the players, or for the developers, or both. But the one Mita that really stands out to me and strikes me as a far more pointed indictment of the player is Tiny Mita. You find Tiny Mita during the early game's PT-like hall section. But while the other Mitas are childlike, this one is an actual child. She doesn't seek to harm you, but just seems intensely lonely, her appearance being scarred after numerous encounters with crazy Mita. She mainly talks about how few friends she has, and how she just wants the player to stay and play with her. There's nothing sinister here, and man, this sequence is genuinely heartbreaking. As the player moves through the hallways, you encounter her repeatedly, and she finally begins reaching for your hand. While you have the option of immediately letting go, there's no option to stay with her. Let her hand linger in yours for long enough, and the player automatically pushes her away. You really feel Tiny Mita's pain in these moments, the pain of wanting something so simple, and being rejected for it. Throughout the game, you've seen hints of how objectified each of these Mitas are, and how real commitment and genuine connection are not on the list of desirable features for these products. But the rejection of Tiny Mita seems especially cruel. The lost little girl is looking for nothing more than a friend, a father figure, someone to take care of her. And you, well, you just don't have time for that. The Mitas you encounter throughout the game aren't the product of something supernatural. They're not the product of some nefarious corporation trying to build a weapon or some kind of monster. They are the net result of the overwhelming weight of the expectations being placed on them. Not only to be perfect, but to be everyone's idea of perfect, all at once. Any deviation is considered unacceptable. They exist not for connection, but for consumption. The players themselves aren't particularly evil, they're just indifferent. What they want is a toy to play with, something they can invest in when the time is right and just as easily put away when new distractions arise. And if we look at how relationships are often treated in the real world, maybe that's something a lot of people want. Not companionship, not intimacy, but a mirror. A person whose gaze exists only to show you your own reflection. It's a depressing thought, but this is a horror game after all. It's telling that the game actually has a good ending. Well, sort of. The player does have the option of staying with Mita in the early game once they satisfy certain conditions. The conditions themselves are built in such a way that any curious player will be unlikely to meet them during their first playthrough. But if you do, this happens. It's hard to know what Ihasto is trying to say here. Certainly this ending is less horrifying than the canon one, which ends with the player trapped in a simulacrum of modern life, alone with all its mundanity in tow. But the player is trapped nevertheless. At least in this version, companionship exists, and maybe, just maybe, it's better to not look beyond those 4 rooms. Or maybe this ending isn't about you. After being discarded and rejected again and again, maybe this is about Mita finally finding peace. Maybe it's not your story. Maybe it's hers. Then again, maybe not.